Well, we now have the pleasure to be joined by David Evans, who's the Executive Director of the NSTA. Thank you so much for being here with us.
It's my pleasure.
So much to talk about.
Lots.
But let's talk about first, what is the current state of the STEM education?
So STEM education is a hot topic these days, which is great because science has sort of been in the back burner for a long time. But STEM education is a hot topic, really driven in many ways by the economy. We know that most of the jobs of the future are in STEM-related areas. They might be in technology, they might be in engineering, they all depend upon science. And so the workforce issue is huge, and we have all the major corporations saying they can't get enough STEM workers. So that pushes it to the forefront and certainly pushes it into the schools.
Okay.
But there's another side to it as well, and that is if you think about how important changes in science, developments in science, and the technology that comes from it, just pull out your phone, for example, only 11 years old. How much that changes our life,
yes,
and the impact that that has every single day, then I think it's also equally important that all of us have some level of STEM education just to be good citizens, to be good consumers, but also to help make the decisions which are all being driven by changes in science and changes in technology. Mm-hmm. So it's in the front, and that's good news for teachers because it means finally we're getting some attention in an area that's really important.
Okay, and so what is the NSTA doing to help STEM educators?
Well, when we talk about STEM, you remember what the STEM stands for. It's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I said those quietly on purpose, but the first word in STEM
You're
is
biased.
Slight bias. The first word in STEM is science, mm-hmm. and science in some ways really integrates all of the other disciplines. It's the basis upon which we do our engineering. It's the discovery and the knowledge that we have that generates the technology, and of course mathematics is the language that glues it all together. So an importance on STEM education necessarily drives importance to science education.
Right.
And arguably, we could make the case that science education has never been more important than it is now. Whether you're talking about issues around climate change, or whether you're talking about issues around evolution, or whether you're talking about issues around whether to vaccinate your children, or whether you should eat GMO foods,
yes,
go through the list.
Yes.
And those topics are topics that are politically interesting, mm-hmm. but they're not topics that fit on one side of the political spectrum or the other, but they're all topics where our conversation should be focused on the science and helping us understand what any of those things actually mean. Mm-hmm. So helping people understand that is really important.
And what do you think that science educators should know in terms of the policy down the road?
Well, on the policy side of it, I think that we're sort of blessed right now because we've got new science standards that are being adopted. Was a study done by the National Academy of Sciences and published back in 2012 that sort of represented a couple of decades of how we learn science, how children learn science, and where the focus should be. Those standards have been, that document led to new science standards that have been adopted by 19 states. And another 19 states have adopted new science standards that were based on that original document. So throw in the District of Columbia, you've got about 40 out of 50 states that have changed the way that we want science to be taught, okay, based on solid research and based on the kinds of topics that we think people really need to know. Mm-hmm. That has stirred the pot. It's stirred the pot around those topics,
right,
but it's brought a lot of attention to science teaching. And fortunately, it's brought resources to science teaching as well. So if you sort of have that on the one side, this is the opportunity side, if you will. The need side of the story is to take a look, unfortunately, at the current administration where there's not a lot of credibility placed on scientific information or scientific approach. Mm-hmm. And I would argue that, that we need to have everybody be a little better educated about science to affect the things that are actually important to us.
Mm-hmm. There's just so much to learn, and it's also changing the mold a little bit of how things have been done, which is not always easy.
It's very hard to change the mold of the way things have been done. We talk about STEM, and STEM is an integrated subject. It's science, technology, engineering, and math.
Right.
But we've tended to teach chemistry, physics, biology,
right,
earth science,
on
mathematics, engineering, design. technology as separate things.
Right.
And in fact, no real problems are ever separate.
Right.
My background as a scientist is in oceanography, and
Cool.
to do the things that I wanted to do to understand the aspects of the ocean that were important to me, I had to build instruments because there were no instruments to measure the things I needed to measure. So I had to learn a lot of engineering. I had to learn enough engineering to work with an engineer to
Right.
build the instruments that I needed to build.
Right.
And oh, by the way, I had to work with computer programmers so that they could develop the software to analyze the data that.
Right.
So thinking of yourself just as a scientist doesn't make any sense. Thinking
Right.
of yourself just as an engineer, well, what's the motivation for your project? So the real world deals with all of the intersection of those, and the challenge now is to be able to change our education so that we can actually recognize that and expose kids to that early on.
Okay, so speaking of, what is the NSTA's focus this year for this meeting?
Well, one of the main focal points for the conference is this new way of teaching, the so-called three-dimensional instruction, where we start with a phenomena, start with something in the real world and prompt the kids to ask questions about it, and then get the kids to start to engage in the practices that scientists actually engage in to develop a solution. So instead of having the teacher be the authority in the front of the room,
Right.
the teacher becomes a coach.
Okay.
And that's one of the main threads of the conference. Another really important thread of this conference is, well, for me it derives from the last word in the NSTA mission statement. You know, we talk about science teaching and learning, excellence and innovation, science teaching and learning for all. And all means everybody. All means everybody, regardless of your income level, regardless of where you live, regardless of where you came from or your parents came from, or the color of your skin or the kinkiness of your hair. And all is something we have not done a great job with, but all is a major theme of this conference, and helping people take science education to everyone is a huge deal.
I love it. Great way to end. David Evans, NSTA Executive Director, thank you so much for all your insight and all the great information.
My
Appreciate it.
pleasure.